Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this event for the Kirchner Fellowship. We'll say a lot more about that in a minute, but I first want to extend a very special welcome to Deputy Consul General of Brazil here in New York, Minister Lucia Moreira, if I've said that correctly. It's great to have you with us tonight. It's good to have you. Also, sitting at the other end of the table, as you probably all know, is Mary Watson, our Executive Dean at the Schools for Public Engagement. She will be moderating the discussion tonight. There are two people between them who I'll introduce in just a few minutes. Tonight we're celebrating the President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship Program. It was established in 2011 to honor the legacy of former President Kirchner, so we're completing our 7th year of doing that. And it's been made possible by a very generous grant of support from the late Julian Studley, who was a trustee of the New School and a great supporter of OLA, the Observatory on Latin America. And it's also made possible by sponsorship with our partner, the National University of St. Martin's in Argentina. So let me first ask Margaret Goodman, Professor Margaret, to come up and say a little bit about both the fellowship and OLA.
Thank you, David. Well, as we usually do, because this is the 7th time, actually 14th, if I am okay. Before launching the program, we would like to remind you that the OLA was formally launched in September 2006 by the former Argentine President, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, and is directed by Professor Michael Cohen. I am pleased to present again in this occasion, as in all the other public lectures of the fellows in these last years, the 3 main objectives of the OLA. First, the main objective is to study and observe the process of political, social, urban, and economic change in Latin America. Second is to link institutions in the United States and Latin America which are working to understand the challenges of building more just and democratic worlds and societies in our globalized world. For this purpose, we have created opportunities for Latin American leaders to directly express here in New York their voices to our audiences in New York, and overall, the OLA in these last years had more than 100 events in the New School and in Argentina, in Chile, in Ecuador, and in Mexico. The third objective is to work together with Latin American institutions to further these goals, developing programs, collaborative projects with local and institutional international organizations. As you might know, perhaps, and you can see in our website, the OLA has 5 themes, 5 main programs. First, the Latin America on the Move program, which brings speakers to New York. Among them, we have Tabaré Vázquez, President of Uruguay, Ollanta Humala as a presidential candidate from Peru, Néstor Kirchner several times, and the last in 2010, Rafael Correa, President of Ecuador, Alicia Bárcenas, Secretary General of the UN Economic Commission on Latin America, ECLAC. We have Álvaro García Linera, Vice President of Bolivia in 2015, and several ministers, public servants, and representatives of NGOs from Latin America. Then we have another program, the Building Latin American Bicentennial, that held 2 important international calls for paper and audio visuals. And since 2009, we have published a couple of books and also got a request from the presidency some years ago of Argentina to prepare a report for the bicentennials in Argentina in 2010. Then we have the Design and Social Development program, which is an interdisciplinary one, collaborative one, which together with the Global Urban Future Project had a relevant presence in the UN Habitat 3 in Quito in October 2016, and prepared, published, and presented two main products, the Habitat Commitment Index and a book, Habitat in Depth, 20 Years of Urban Policies in Latin America, in Spanish, but it is translated and it is under consideration for publication. The students here helped to the translation and it is ready. We hope it is ready. Anyway, we have a new initiative, the Cuba program, now underway, which is preparing a studio course which will take place in the spring, working for the Oficina del Historiador de La Habana, which is the historian office of La Habana. It's a special studio course that it is being prepared by Michael Cohen and Anthony Tong to take students, graduate and some undergraduate also, to La Habana to work for this office. And finally, we have the President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship Program, which is, we think, particularly relevant in this moment, in which, after a decade of progressive governments, we are the challenge of other administrations. Now, some more info about the fellowship. In May 2015, when this call was closed, the 2017-2018 call was closed, we received 107 applications from 17 countries in Latin America. We have to say that this is the third year that we are calling in all Latin America, not only in South America, as we did in the first 4 years. The selection process is quite intense, and it is composed by 3 steps. This is to say that the fellows that they are sitting with us today, they have passed 3 different juries, one after the other. The first is an on-site jury that met in Buenos Aires in the Universidad Nacional de San Martín in June of 2017 and selected half of the 107 applications. The second jury was composed by 30 jurors from all Latin America that went out through of course, through digital, it was a digital inquiry. And these 30 juries were coming from 10 different countries, including many New School faculty who also worked in this process. And finally, there is the jury meeting in August of 2017 in Buenos Aires to select the 4 final winners. In this jury, that it's a jury composed by David Van Zandt, who is the 7th time in a row going to Buenos Aires to participate in this jury, and we thank you a lot. The rector, which is the president of the Universidad Nacional de San Martín. We have also the former president of the National Bank of Argentina, Mercedes Marco del Pont. We have the Argentine, the representative for South America, for Argentina, Uruguay, and Uruguay of the UN Economic Commission, ECLAC, Martina Vélez, and some other people. This was a very intense moment in which 12 juries were discussing who were the 4 selected fellows among the 20 finalists. That they went also through a test of English done by our faculty in the New School. Well, some numbers, and with this I finished. From 2011 on, the fellowship received more than 760 applications from all around Latin America. In these last 6 years, without counting our 4 fellows of this year, we had 20 fellowship awarded. With this of this year will be 24. And up to today, without counting our present fellows, we have had 6 fellows from Argentina, which is 1 each year, 5 from Brazil, with these ones will be 6, 2 from Mexico, 2 from Peru, 1 from Bolivia, 1 from Cuba, 1 from Ecuador, and 1 from Colombia, and 1 from Uruguay. You see, it is it's quite an interesting representation. Then, would you like to present the fellows? Who are the fellows selected this year?
Well, first of all, let me say that it's been a real pleasure to go to Buenos Aires for the last 7 years and be able to participate in this in the selection process. The candidates we see, which every year have been, I think they were 21 or 22 this past year, every year in that range, the candidates are just absolutely spectacular. And it frankly is very difficult to pick out the four best ones. But it's also a lot of fun, certainly for me, and to get to know the other members of the jury and to be able to see the resumes and portfolios of so many excellent young both scholars but more importantly public servants who are doing serving their countries or their areas in one way or the other, who we very much hope and are pretty confident will be future leaders in a very progressive Latin America. So it's been a real honor for me to do it those past 7 years. And although I don't think there's a lot of suspense about this, I do want to announce our winners. Don't worry, you are two of them. We didn't make you come all the way here not to be a winner. But first is Maria Sofia Bernat from Argentina, who will be speaking to us tonight, as well as Paulo Rossi from Brazil, who will also be speaking tonight. And then this coming February, our two other winners will join us. They are Patricia Martinez Corral from Colombia and Daniela Casarina Sanchez from Mexico. And we look forward to putting them through the same ringer of activity that we put you through. Please don't call them and tell them that it's too much and not to come, because we really do want to see them here. But I do hope on behalf of the New School that you have had so far and will continue to have a very enjoyable experience here in New York, here at the New School, that also once you leave, you will consider yourselves to be members or alumni, as we say, of the New School. So it's great to have you here. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank President Zandt, Professor Margarita Goodman, Director of the Observatory on Latin America, Dean Mary Watson, Professor Cohen, for his invitation to the Consulate General of Brazil to participate on this panel. This is the second time I have the pleasure to join you. I was here 2 years ago, and I have to say I'm very proud to acknowledge that Brazil has been represented in 5 editions of the Néstor Kirchner Fellowship since 2013, I think. 6 times already.
No, we count.
Oh, this is the 6th. Okay, more proud yet. The President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship fosters a much-needed continental debate around crucial issues that traverse societies, economies, and states throughout Latin America. It has awarded very bright academics and young leaders in the continent, including this year's distinguished fellows, Maria Sofia Bernat and Paulo Rossi, who I compliment for their achievements. Mr. Paulo Rossi is a housing specialist with over 90 years of experience in affordable and social housing policy making. He holds an undergraduate degree in architecture and urbanism and a master's degree in landscape and environment by the University of São Paulo. He's also a specialist in marketing management by the INSPER Institute in São Paulo. Paulo Rossi completed his graduate studies with honors at the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies in Rotterdam, Netherlands. He was also a fellow of the German Cooperation Agency at the Managing Global Governance Program in Bonn. As a public servant at the Ministry of Cities, Paulo Rossi has devoted himself to the improvement and monitoring of the Minha Casa Minha Vida program, which is the My House, My Life program. the largest social housing program currently in progress in Latin America. He coordinated several studies for regulatory improvement, housing finance allocation, and building and urban minimum standards. These enriching experiences in the academic and public sectors have brought him here tonight to present some of his ideas. Urban housing is still an important challenge for Brazilian public policies, and it is refreshing to observe innovative works that bring attention to an issue that is critical for our social development. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Good afternoon all. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I really would like to thank the Minister Lucia Maiara for introducing me. Actually, I was surprised with the description because I didn't recognize it myself. I thought, oh, 9 years, oh, but it's been so many studies. He must be good, but it is not like that. But I was quite happy with the introduction. Thank you so much. Actually, I would like to start my presentation thanking the Universidad Nacional de San Martín, the Observatory of Latin America, and the New School for giving me the opportunity to participate of the President Néstor Kirchner Fellowship Program. I think it's a unique opportunity to promote and establish a dialogue, not just between Latin American countries, but also between the public sector and the academy. And I think that could be very fruitful. As from the government side, usually we don't have so many opportunities to discuss this topic, to bring this topic to discussion. And I think that's a very unique opportunity. Thank you so much. I appreciate a lot your comments. My special thanks go to Margarita Goodman, Michael Cohen, Maria Carichosa, and Clara Bon for receiving me and Sophia and supporting us in the intensive 2 weeks experience in New York. It's been precious, and I think Sophia and I were going to talk a lot in the future. We are already friends. I also would like to thank the Brazilian federal government and also the presence of the Brazilian Deputy Consul General, despite the fact that I'm really not here in official mission, so I'm not representing the federal government, but I am in a way a public servant, and I have a commitment to the federal government as well. And I know that most of these opportunities like this one I get because I'm a public servant, and I'm very thankful for that. I think there's an investment in the public sector in Brazil, and I think we should be proud of that. Finally, I would like to thank the presence of the audience for coming. Some of you already saw us talking 2-3 times again, so I think I hope that the third it's better, I think. And some of them actually in the last presentation I talked about the program as a whole. I tried to explain, and that's not really the idea this time. This time we're just trying to focus in a policy problem, so it's just going to make a small frame of the big picture. Well, before talking about my subject, I would like to introduce myself. So my name is Paulo Alves. I'm an architect and urban planner. I was born in São Paulo, where I studied at the University of São Paulo. It's a public university. And 5 years ago, I moved to Brasilia, where I became infrastructure analyst at the National Secretariat for Housing in the Ministry of Cities. I'm a public servant, what means that actually I have a permanent job in the federal government. So my commitment is to the long term. Doesn't matter what happens, I will be there, and I will try to keep this project going. Before entering the federal government, I worked 3 years in the multinational real estate company. It's called Cirela in Brazil, developing affordable housing projects in São Paulo state area. I was not engaged actually in doing project design, so I was not an architect, but actually I was doing a project formulation, more with the economic viability of the development. And I think that gave me a really different perspective in the federal government, working in the federal government. In different positions, I've been working with My House, My Life social housing program that we are talking about since it was launched in 2009, so it's been 8 years. Nowadays, I mostly dedicate to monitoring and improving the regulation of the federal social housing program, And I've been using a lot of the knowledge of my previous work that gave me in order to do that. Probably because of my professional trajectory, but I would say also academic, because I studied in public and private institutions, and where I worked in public and private institutions, this tension between the public and the private sector interests me, always fascinated me. But I strongly believe that these partnerships are necessary and can be fruitful. The challenge is how to design these partnerships, ensuring that the public interest comes first. And that's what I propose myself in this lecture, to make a critical analysis about the peripheralization in My House, My Life housing states, discussing how government arrangements defined by the federal government played an important role in this phenomenon and how they can be used in order to bring a social housing back to the city centers. In March 2009, the Brazilian federal government launched the low-income home ownership programs My House, My Life. So mostly, I don't know if most of you know, but actually we don't do so much social rent in Brazil. We always strike with private property. So the objective was to increase low-income family access to the formal housing market, and that was made through subsidies. Around $30 billion were invested in public subsidies. The idea was to stimulate the production in large scale, so in total the goal was defining 4.5 million housing units, address the housing deficit, but also the future demand, and the housing deficit in 2010 census was estimated in about 6 million houses, and stimulate the economic growth. I think stimulate the economic growth is a central part of this story that we need to tell. I would like to quote Professor Faranad Mifarab, that wrote a paper called Public-Private Partnerships, the Trojan Horse of Neoliberal Development, that highlights the importance of the name of the actor behind the policy solution. She says, how a partnership originates reveals much about the power relationships that will emerge amongst participants who initiated the process and sought partnerships with the other sectors is significant. The housing market in Brazil for the middle and high income lived a boom between 2005 and 2010, which led to increase the number of jobs in construction sector, such as the appearance of large real estate market companies that became politically powerful. But in 2009, the American subprime crisis severely impacted the construction sector in Brazil, and My House, My Life was used as a counter-cyclical policy to avoid mass unemployment. In 2012, Minister of Cities published a booklet where he estimated that for every 1 million paid under the program, $750,000 was producing additional income, 83 jobs were created, and the program maintained a flow that reached 1.4 million jobs, both direct and indirect, in 2012. During My House, My Life program implementation, several studies were conducted to analyze and evaluate the program, some of them with the Ministry of City support, and I think that's very important. It's important because in 2012, the National Council for Scientific Development, actually in Portuguese says is Conselho Nacional de Desenvolvimento Científico e Tecnológico, it's called CNPq, together with the Ministry of Cities, designated about 1.5 million in resources to support 30 researchers' projects regarding My House, My Life production analysis. Several scholars participated of these projects, and the location of the housing state was a central issue discussed in the final reports. That's important to highlight that the Ministry of Cities was not trying to hide the problem, but actually to open to debate it. Despite the American success of the program, the inadequacy of some large housing states' location in the periphery of the cities became a political issue. The phenomenon was referred as the peripherization of the poor. The term peripherization has been used with different meanings over the years, but also by different authors. In Brazil, the term was frequently used associated with the process of informal urbanization, and expressing the expulsion of the poor from the urban centers to peripheral areas lacking basic infrastructure and service, and generation the establishment of informal settlement in the periphery of the cities. Now it's being used in another context, and that the main difference is that the formal process of urbanization. Since then, we used to talk about informality, and now we are talking about the formal market producing peripherization as well. In this presentation, I'm not going to explore the concept in depth because it seems a very complex concept and we need to get much more research to define. But it's important to stress that regarding my house, my life, peripheralization is related to location, not distance to the city center, but to inadequate access to infrastructure, service, and job opportunities. Here I have some photos that show some examples of these developments, and they are all in different regions of the city. The red dot in the satellite photo shows where is the development, and probably you can see where's the urban area. Most of them you can see they are quite monotonous in the landscape, and this is also happening in all these other projects. The number of housing units is also something important to address the peripherization. Most of these neighborhoods have 2,000 or 2,700 housing units. That means that 10,000 people will live there. That's the third example. This is in the north of the city. We are trying to address peripherization about the costs as well. How so the cost? So we have infrastructural cost and social cost. The infrastructural costs include an efficient use of existing infrastructure, assuming that areas that already have infrastructure are not being used in an efficient way. So actually we assume that there were better areas to do that. There are hidden costs for the future infrastructure expansions. As water, light, and road and sewage solutions were compulsory, actually all these developments already have this type of basic infrastructure. When we talk about hidden costs, we are regarding the infrastructure the costs represented by the construction of new schools, healthcare centers, providing public transportation, and garbage collection, among others. The social costs were much more complex, actually. The emergence of low-income ghettos, as housing units were exclusively for the problem beneficiary, several of them found themselves in a vulnerable situation, contributing to the future stigma of these neighborhoods. Hidden social cost relates to the access to job opportunities, time consuming in commuting, and distance of existing and consolidated neighborhood. I think one of the concepts that really embraces all this social cost is denial of the right to the city. And I will quote Adésio Fernandes' text that he says that the right of all urban dwellers to collectively enjoy the benefits, cultural plurality, social diversity, economic advantage, and opportunities of urban life, as well to actively participate in urban management. We know that locations plays a strong role when we discuss the right to the city, even if it's not just that. My House, My Life comprise 4 different modalities. Actually, it's not just one program. It's several programs. It's like an umbrella. The inadequate location that critiques that mainly focus is one of these modalities. They call the business modalities. In this graphic, I wanted just to highlight this modality and explain why it was the focus of the discussion. First, because even if they this modality account just for 32% of the housing units that's produced, that is a total of 4.5 million, is the one that is mostly subsidized. So actually 82% of the subsidies were concentrated in this 32% of housing produced. The second reason why it was the critiques came to this modality is because the modality where the private sector assumes the leading position. So we have here a small flow chart. So you see that the private developers propose the housing states, the local government approves this project, financial institutions analyze and approve as well the financial juridical capacity of these companies. The private developer builds, local government selects the beneficiary, and local government conducts the social work. In total, so it's around 1.5 million houses goal. This modality was presented in 1,000 out of 5,565 municipalities in Brazil. The family income maximum is around $710 per month, and the housing unit prices go up to $33,000, that can change depending of location. The beneficiary counterpart is actually, it's quite small compared to the price of the housing unit and also to the interest rate that you could get in the market. So you pay around 10 to 15% of the family income for 10 years. The municipality's approach to the policy problem or the focus in the idea that the causes for inadequate allocation was mainly because the local government limited capacity of some municipalities to manage their territory in a sustainable and efficient way. So the focus that in that flow chart that we see, when you just go to the local government, there should be a lot of instruments that we say to manage the land. So they have master plans, they have land apportionment law, they have land use law, they have city statute instruments that actually they could apply, and they have local plans, I'm sorry for the ignorance, but they have local plans for housing development as well. And so in a way, the federal government says it fails. All these instruments fails if we are producing the periphery, and the municipality fails with this project. So we could say that the master plans were inadequate, or we can say that weak approval processes, there were weak approval process. The minister cities approach, so with this concept about the problem, was to ensure better located development by advising municipalities. And one of these strategies was publishing a book that's how to produce houses well located with resources of My House, My Life resources. This actually it was written by several famous scholars, and also Raquel Ronick participated in writing this. And the idea, the concept was that using the instrument of city statute would ensure a better located development. We're going to discuss if this actually is a strong argument or not. The second idea was develop a federal government complementary urban standards, and that was very interesting because for the first time, and that's being applied, we are bringing the urban scale to the federal government, and also causes challenges because we are fighting with some municipalities about these standards because they say the standards don't fit them, and that's the problem, to define standards at the federal level that actually are going to apply to all the localities. And creating a federal government project approval instances as well. And that was very complicated because of personnel. So some projects that had more than 1,500 housing units, it started to go to the Ministry of City so we could analyze the project as well and see how they integrate to the existing city. That was the strategy. Till now, I've been talking actually from the perspective of the Minister of Cities, and now I'm actually talking about myself. As a public servant, make an independent critical analysis. I really don't think I'm far away from the discussions around the Minister of Cities, but I'm not talking from the Ministry of Cities perspective. I think this is important to highlight. So I had some questions actually that approach was not actually addressing. It's why the phenomenon was observed in cities that at first have have technical skills and staff to proper institutional framework. So actually middle-sized cities with very good public servant bodies were also producing the periphery. So it's not just about the lack of technical capacity. They had the technical capacity, or at least some of them. What explains the difference in municipalities committing to better urban location? So what we saw is some municipalities were very much more committed than the others. And what's the share of the federal government responsibility in the peripheralization phenomenon? So actually, what I'm discussing is that the way that I allocate resources also influences what is happening in the local level. For that, I made more or less, I made use of a methodology, focusing that the actors' interactions are decisive for the outcome of projects. So it's the governance perspective that I would like to address to that other more technical perspective. And focusing the actors' interactions at the local level, what was happening. The methodology is the policy analysis of multi-actor system. There's an author discussing that, and the main idea is to make an inventory of the actors and identify the perceptions and the interest and the responsibilities they play in the process of implementation. Most of the data that I used that actually were data for all the workshops and this research that we use. Actually, it's not the proper way to do a research, and this is why this is really not a scientific word, but much more a first step to discussion, because I participated in several workshops and I got all this information. So we interview a lot of developers, a lot of municipalities. The first moment is really to map all the key actors that play an important role in the process. And it was quite easy to see the first ones, which ones are the main important ones. But actually, when you really try to understand those that really play a role, that you see that it's really not really clear, because even the public sector, there are several actors, and there are a lot of different interests between them. Their perception of the problem of the peripheralization is different. And it makes much more complex to really bring all these different perspectives and to build a project and to understand how they are going to act at the local level. At the actor analysis, we've so more or less define all these main actors. This is a short version, and I'm not going to detail. It's more or less like a table just to show how we did it, or I did it. And just to put, like, for instance, that the presidency, the National Secretariat for Housing, they are both from the public sector, but they have different perceptions. So, for instance, they all had the idea that achieving the goals, that producing the 4.5 housing units was a fundamental issue, even more fundamental than bringing the urban dimension to discussion to the process. We saw that developers also wanted to have more profit, and that's quite obvious, but they were looking for places that could be faster as well. The beneficiary in this modality didn't play an important role, and there was a sense that actually they are receiving the units for free. It was quite complicated because they didn't have the idea that they have the power also to discuss the projects. One of that I would like to also highlight is the financial institution, because this program is run by public financial institution. Just public financial institution. But public financial institutions are always private organizations, so they also look for profit, they have the goals, and they need to hire a lot of the housing units. So they are all committed with achieving the goals. So that's where the key findings actually of this analysis in a very resumed way. The achievement of the qualitative goals led all key actors' behavior, so influence actors' willingness to produce or not better located housing estates, create a sense of urgency. So it was now or never. Most of these municipalities understood that actually they should do it as soon as possible, the houses, or should get the houses, the investment as soon as possible. Also the private sector thought the same. Also the financial institutions feel the same. And also the federal government feel the same, because the problem, the scale of the problem of housing was so big, and the need for economic growth was so important that actually we needed to do it fast. So land in the periphery reduces the transactional cost. It's not just about the cheap land, it's about the fast land. It's much easier, it's much more efficient to do in the periphery, where you have a urban area and no boundaries. And all this, if you're far away, you have much less discussion with other actors and other problems. I divided in three key issues actually, three key findings. The second one is developers dominated public resource allocation. So what we saw in the territory when we analyzed all the countries as the uneven investments among municipalities. So even if we consider that housing deficit proportionally in all the cities could be a guide, some of them could achieve all the housing deficit with this program, and some of them actually didn't hire. So we have 250 out of the 1,000 municipalities that could receive investment that actually couldn't attract any investment from the private sector. They were not really interested, especially because most of them were smaller cities that couldn't get as big developments, and so they are not so profitable for the private sector. Municipalities also compete for developers' attention, so they made a lot of formation of coalitions with the financial institutions, but also with development. And that's also quite complicated. It comes back with the idea of the actors, because most of in these municipalities, especially small municipalities, you don't have very clear actors. Sometimes the municipalities are involved with developers, or one official actually is the owner of the land, that is also the developer, that is also the one that is going to select the beneficiaries. So, and all these things happens in the local level, and we need to take account. So what we saw is that despite the fact that very successful in a way, very effective, there was a lot of power imbalance in the local level. The urban restrictions were reduced or eliminated. So some municipalities thought that actually, if I need to attract investment, I'm not really going to create boundaries. I'm going to take the boundaries off. So do it whatever you can because it's better. And I think that's important to put in their shoes. If, of course, it's better any house than no house for municipality, for political issues, but also for social issues. Good location in that point was perceived as secondary. Not all the municipalities did the same. A lot of them accomplished to do very good housing projects. So my recommendations for the My House, My Life program is to calibrate investments, ensure a competitive scenario on the supply side. What we say is that when we make the goal so big, we created actually, we distorted too much the market. So it was too much for the market to really give an answer. So the price of the land, in the end, we were competing with the price of the land about themselves. We were the only owners, only buyers, and we influenced it. And that was important as well. To reduce short-term goals or define long-term goals, I think would be much more possible and effective. Empower municipalities, so really define the quantitative goals and give them the chance to develop that for a long time so they can really prepare themselves for those investments. Most of these municipalities, actually, they don't have master plans thinking about the program because 10 years ago, no one could think that so much money was going to be invested in social housing. Limit the gold distribution instrument among cities and states because what happened is actually a lot of developers ask to do in different places because they're not able to do in the selected cities or those cities that didn't have any development to the moment. Limit the size of developments, and that's ongoing effort. We already limit, so we are not going to see more 2,000 housing units developments. The maximum now is 500, and that's one of the parts I've been participating. And foster the participation of future beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries in social housing approval process. I don't have an answer how to do that, but we could establish actually that this type of project should go to the municipality and should make an open section to discuss the projects. They should have different governance stages that actually the population could participate. That's actually my final slide, my final considerations. Federal government resources allocation have a strong influence in local level and urban dynamics. And I think also talks about my interviews here that I did with the federal government officials in the United States. Most of them, they say actually we don't play any role in the cities. And from my perspective, they play a strong role in the cities. They are actually allocating a lot of money. And the way they decided to allocate will really define what is going to happen. It's faster and more profitable to produce houses than the cities. I think that concept that actually economic growth is very complicated because especially in developing countries, we found a strategy that producing houses is very good for the economic growth for a short term. But producing cities is still not a profitable thing. There are not too much people engaged or private sector engaged in developing cities. The opinion for public and private arrangement, the option, for public and private arrangements increase multi-actor environment complexity. So what we saw is that when we decide for public-private arrangements, you're going to bring a lot of power imbalances, and these imbalances actually are not necessarily in the federal level, but are in the local level. So the discussion that we used to have with developers in the federal level were quite equal. But when they started to play the role in the local level, that you see that they put the local level in a position that was a power imbalance. So they were really not really wanting to create boundaries for and to receive these investments. The idea that public interest and private interest is very complicated as well, especially when you discuss public financial institutions. They need to do profit as well, and most of the time, the way that you are paying for them, it's going to define the result you're going to get. Actually, for them to build big developments was also a good thing, and that we change it as well. So actually, we need to change all the actors, how they are going to behave. Policymakers need to be able to assume all and contradictory key actors' point of view. I think that's one of the perspectives that you really need to put in the shoes of everyone, especially in the federal level. In the federal level, we design relationships and we don't design the standards so much. We are really going to decide who's going to do what and how it's going to influence. And the last one, that the political cost shouldn't be underestimated, especially when we talk about city statute instruments. And going back to that slide about the publication that we made, so how to produce well located, people underestimated the cost to implement all the instruments at the local level. It's very complicated. It's not just about re-election, but there are legislative power, they have elite powers, a lot of powers. So it's quite an easy job for the federal government just to deliver a set of instruments and say, please apply them. That's my presentation. Thank you so much.
Just to give the Deputy Counsel General a moment, would you like to ask a question about the Brazilian context? And then we'll move to the next presentation.
I'd like to compliment Claudia once more.
Thank you so much.
Work. And I think I've read in the synopsis of your work that the number of built houses were larger than the. Thank you. As casas entregues. Is there a difference in that number, or it was just in that moment when?
No, I think we're, I don't know, I don't remember this data in specific, but we have different moments. When we say what we hire, it's actually what we contract. Then we have what we construct, and then what we deliver it. It's a process. Most of the time, this process takes 3 years. So actually, we didn't deliver 4.5 housing units till now, but we already delivered 3.5 housing units, 2.5 million housing units. What is quite a success in the Programa de Aceleração do Crescimento PAC, the program of growth that Brazil has. So actually, it was quite a success. Maybe that's the data that you are talking about.
And the program has a deadline? Is it?
The first, the program has 3 phases. The first phase was to build 1 million houses in 2009 and 2010, or to hire those, because it takes 3 years to deliver most of the case. And in the second phase, actually, it was a very political important program, became the social program, together with Bolsa Família and other programs, and they decided to increase 3.5 million houses. In this the government now that we have added 700,000 houses as well. So it's increasing, and it started as a program, not as a policy. Actually, I don't know if you have this different in English, but we say in Portuguese makes sense. A program is like a small part, a policy is the big perspective, and now it's becoming a policy. So if it's going to continue, it's going to, and it's continue depends, even the change of the government, they decided to keep not just the program, but most of the advances that we suggest as the technical body for urban, better urban integration.
And still, if you allow me,
Sure.
A last question. I wonder if you were familiar with the New York program of affordable houses, if you could compare both.
Actually, I'm not enough familiar, but I still have some meetings, including with Doug, that I think is going to explain me a lot. But I'm quite amazed. I'm not the person to discuss that, but I'm not very positive about the programs that you have here in New York, because I think it's a problem without solution. It's going to consume so many subsidies that's impossible, because the number of rich people that you have here and that you don't have I think it's a totally different context that we have in Brazil. What I can say, that maybe the only comparison that makes sense, is that the program in Brazil, My House, My Life, also doesn't run really well in metropolitan areas, because in metropolitan areas the dynamics are much more complex. And with the idea, we cannot actually separate the land and the house. And maybe you can do it more or less in middle-sized cities, but in big cities you cannot. So you're really talking about how do you regulate landmarks to make affordable housing, and not just how I'm going to address subsidies to produce affordable housing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I will have the pleasure to introduce very briefly Sofia Bernat, and I want to share with you the comments the comments, but we received email from the Deputy Consul General of Argentina, Eduardo Almirante Arena, who joined this program many times. He couldn't come. He sent his apologies for not being here. But we know that the Consulate of Argentina in the last 13 days has been marred by the problems of the 5 Argentine tourists that they were killed in the bypass of the West Side Highway. Then they were, and they are still working with this problem. Then I, as an Argentinian myself, I will take the privilege of present Sofia Bernat. Sofia is a PhD candidate in journalism at the social communication of journalism and social communication at the National University of La Plata, Argentina, an important and old university, who has just submitted her thesis to the doctoral commission, kind of 10 days ago, or
Yes.
now 7 or 8.5 or something like this. She holds a bachelor degree in the same field. She worked at the civil organization Techo, which is a very well-known organization in South America. She coordinated the community development area. And she worked also with the organization Habitat, which is an organization that it is working within the scope of the National Senate of Argentina. And it is integrated by the most progressive activists and scholars of the country, advocating for better housing and urban conditions for the vulnerable population of the country, which I think it's the place where you met many relevant practitioners. I won't talk about what Sofia is presenting because she will present and our dean will comment and moderate. Then Sofia, come on.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. First of all, I'd like to thank all the authorities of the new school and of the National University of San Martin from Argentina for the fellowship that I've been awarded. And I'd also like to thank all the researchers and counselors who have made very significant contributions to my research and that have been very kind and helpful during my stay here, especially thanks to Michael, Margarita, Clara and Maria, and of course Paulo, that has been a great partner during my stay here. Today I'm invited to talk about the relocation of Ringelet slum. Perhaps I should begin by stressing that this relocation process has been very significant for the community because it highlights the ways in which socio-urban transformations can modify sense structures. The neighborhood chosen is located in La Plata, on the banks of the El Gato stream, and after the floods of April 2nd, 2013 that this city suffered, the government implemented a relocation project. In this presentation, I'm addressing the question, how did the inhabitants organize themselves and participate prior to the move? That is to say, how did they participate to belong to the city, to access to their right to the city? I'll start off by analyzing how the inhabitants organized themselves and participated in assemblies once they were informed of the relocation project. As participation is concerned, I consider it as a way of symbolizing and inhabiting a territory, often endowing it with meanings of appropriating that territory. So I'm going to discuss 2 case studies, the one from Hidden City and the one from First to Third Street. I will explain this in a minute. This is the plan of the presentation. First of all, I'm going to explain the concepts and the methodology, then the relocation process and the modes of organization of these inhabitants, and finally the conclusions. First of all, I would like to say that when I'm talking about communication, in this presentation I'm not talking about media. As communication is concerned, I consider it as a social production of meanings. Communications come from the Latin word communis, that means communion, share, dialogue, and participation. And when I'm talking about participation, I consider that it's a process that implies taking decisions that can allow social transformations, that needs organization, that can produce knowledge, and that produces meanings linked to inhabiting a territory. And finally, when I'm talking about inhabiting a territory, I refer to a process of mean production, use, and appropriation of the space. So it never ends. We are all the time inhabiting different places. In this sense, this implies a relationship between a subject and a space. During almost 4 years from the day hereof, as you can see, I've been working. I implemented an ethnographic and qualitative methodology. I carried out in-depth interviews and implemented participant observations. Before continuing with my presentation, I would like to read a really short text of Eduardo Galeano, an Uruguayan writer, who stated the following: celebration of the marriage of heart and mind. Why does one write if not to put one's piece together? As soon as we enter school or church, education chops us into pieces, making us divorce soul from body and mind from heart. Learned master of ethics and morals must be those who coined the word senti pensante, feeling thinking, to define the language that tells the truth. This is exactly how I understand research. I believe that my approach was consider senti pensante, and I really think that when we create knowledge or when we try to produce knowledge, we think and we feel. And that's what I'm trying to show you in this presentation. Well, returning to the plan, now we are going to talk about the relocation process. These are my interviewees. They are neighbors from Ringelet slum that have been living at this slum for at least 10 years, but some of them have been living there for 50 years. They had different jobs, in general informal jobs, such as domestic workers. They also had a cooperative and a canteen, and some of them make a living from collective cardboard. As you can see in the picture on your right, that is the canteen in the new neighborhood. Now take a look at this map, please. In the first map, we can see the location of La Plata in Argentina. The red dot indicates where is La Plata. And in the second map, we can see the distance between La Plata city center and Ringelet district. As you can see, they are really near. And finally, I'm going to show you this map. The blue line represents El Gato stream, and the brown one, the rails. Here we can see the location of the slum, which has been historically divided into two groups, Hidden City and First to Third Street. The former were located behind the rails, and the latter were located in front of them. This neighborhood layout is really important for the relocation process that we are going to discuss. I also like to draw your attention to the new neighborhood where all the inhabitants eventually moved. And I also like to draw your attention to the distance between both territories. As you can see, they are really close, but the access to the new one is a bit difficult. Yet the inhabitants decided to move there because they didn't want to lose closeness to school and to the hospital. I'm going to show you another map. Here we can see also both territories and the slum, and the stream, I'm sorry. What I would like to highlight with this map is that the community was really small. We are talking about a relocation of less than 500 families, okay? And where you can see something green, it's like a field. In fact, the inhabitants from Hidden City talk about a field. They had that part to create animals, plants, and in that place their children play football. So this is really important because they miss that garden in the new neighborhood. There is something that I would like to highlight, and is that there is different ways of inhabiting and symbolizing a territory. There are modes of differentiating from the others, establishing thresholds and barriers. A good example of this is the distinction between we and they, the distinction between Hidden City and First to Third Street. It's a distinction between we and they depending who articulates that deictic pronouns. Turning on to the relocation, I would like to say that there were three main causes. First of all, the floods of April 2nd, 2013. They were really devastating for the city. And the second, the subsequent implementation of hydraulic works, and finally, the electrification of the rail system. This picture shows how the floods affected La Plata city and especially the slum. Here we can distinguish the stream, can we? Moving on to participation, I would like to underline that the relocation process fosters modes of organization that for some inhabitants implies an immersion experience, novel or at least unknown until that moment, whereas for others it was an opportunity for strengthening previous practice of organization. We are going again to discuss both case studies. Participation in assemblies was the most important mode of organization. These assemblies were held from March 2014 to May 2016, and the actors who participated there were the neighbors, the government officials, and some social organizations such as Techo, the Evita movement, and an ad hoc film workshop. In fact, this picture was taken by a member of this film workshop. But something changed with these assemblies, especially when the government decided to implement a double relocation process. First to temporary houses, the ones on your left, and then to definite ones, the ones on your right. Something changed with this official decision. And all the neighbors who used to gather at a club, organized their own assemblies. So now we have two smaller assemblies, the one from Hidden City and the one from 1st to 3rd Street. Yet they had the same purpose, to discuss how the relocation was going to continue. Returning to our plan, now we're going to discuss the modes of organization of these two groups. I'm going to be reporting on the experience of Hidden City, and then I'll be talking to you about the experience from 1st to 3rd Street. I'll use pseudonyms to preserve the identity of the interviewees. Let's start with Hidden City then. This part of the slum, as we've just seen on the map, was located behind the rails, and it was composed by neighbors who mostly made a living from collecting cardboard. In Argentina, we call them cartoneros. They were already organized before the relocation process. They had a cooperative and a canteen where they provided meals for children. And they were the first to move to the temporary houses in March 2015, but under certain conditions that I'm going to explain in a few minutes. This picture I took myself from down the rails, and I would like to say that for these inhabitants, the move became a risk. Why? Well, there were some reasons, but it implied abandoning the inhabited space, the neighborhood links, and the familiar, the known ways of inhabiting a territory, and moving to a really deserted and unknown territory. But Hidden City was the first to take that risk. This is another photo of Hidden City that I also took myself, but standing on the rails. As I already told you, they move, but with certain conditions. First, moving in 10 families together to feel safe and secure. They were afraid of being robbed. Second, moving to houses with essential services. Third, maintaining neighborhood layout. And finally, being given a legal document granting the possession of the temporary houses. There is something that I would like to highlight, and is why these inhabitants refused to participate in the assemblies once they were informed of the double relocation process of the move to the temporary houses. There were two main reasons. First, because there were others alien to the slum, and second, because they felt discriminated against. To illustrate the dispute with those alien to the slum, let's read what two neighbors pointed out. So here, what we can see is that they were really angry with those alien to the slum, specifically with social organizations. In this case, we can see that the pronoun we refers to all the inhabitants of the slum, not only from Hidden City, but also from 1st to 3rd Street. And they refers to those alien to the slum. This conception is clearly linked to participation, because you can participate in the relocation process if you live in the slum, while if you don't live, your participation is delegitimized. and that explained why they didn't want to go to the assemblies. Another reason was that they felt discriminated against. Why? Well, because this slum area was a red hazard zone. It was dangerous. To illustrate it, let's read what two inhabitants pointed out. Here we can see that there were stigmas around Hidden City and the construction of cartographies of fear. So Hidden City was insecure, was unsafe. So how did the relationship between the government and these inhabitants continue? They organized their own assemblies behind the rails, they arrived at their decisions and sent their leader to negotiate and discuss with the government officials. So here there was no conflict at all. Now let's turn to the relocation of the inhabitants from 1st to 3rd Street. This part of the slum, as I've already told you, was located in front of the rails. It was composed by neighbors who mainly came from Paraguay, and they were loosely organized before this process. They only with friends and relatives, and they didn't participate in any collective experience before the relocation process. They refused to move for over a year to the temporary houses, and they finally moved in December 2015. I'm going to show you a picture of the part of the slum located from 1st to 3rd Street. As you can see here, there was asphalt in the slum, and this is really important because in the new neighborhood there is no asphalt. Let's see their relocation and ways of thinking in more detail. For these inhabitants, the very idea of leaving their homes created fear and distress, so they refused to move for over a year. Let's read what two neighbors pointed out. Anna said, "At first they offered us very precarious houses or containers. That is because the delegate of the slum offered them to move to a container that was going to be located in a part of the slum known as La Canchita, a little football pitch." And Alicia said, "Moving to a precarious house scared us off. We wanted to relocate, but to a definite one." What does she imply when saying scared us off? That the move refusal created deep distress. Why? Well, because of the possibility of an eviction. These inhabitants refused the official decision to move them to the temporary houses, and they were living in public land, so an eviction was a real possibility for them. And second, because the familiar space, the known space, that is to say the house in the slum, was threatened. Moving on to their participation, I would like to say that unlike Hidden City, for these inhabitants, it was worse participating in assemblies. The assembly was experienced as a meeting place, as a place to meet people and make friends. Also, unlike Hidden City, they appreciated the participation of those alien to the slum, specifically of social organizations. And finally, they felt proud because of their participation, since it allows them to visit different public institutions, such as the Congress and ministries. That empowered them, that gave them a symbolic capital that they felt that they didn't have before the relocation process. So in this case, participation means a certain power position. As they were scared, they organized their own assemblies at the slum corner. And I'm talking about an emergent organization because these inhabitants didn't participate in any collective experience before the relocation process. And this process modified it. It forced them to come together, to get together, to participate in this process. Well, this picture shows an assembly that was held at the slum corner. As you can see, there are many people, there are neighbors, there are members of social organizations, and many children playing. So how did the relationship with the government continue? In this case, and I like Hidden City, there were bitter conflicts with the government. They even named the houses in different ways. For the government officials, the houses were temporary dwellings, while for the neighbors, they were de precarious. Conceiving houses as precarious or temporary was essential to participate in the relocation process, and that explains in part why they refused to move for over a year. What I'd like to underline is that while the government officials emphasized the transitional nature of the houses, the neighbors emphasized their precariousness. As dominant is concerned, I consider it is partly cemented on the ability to name. Not in a deterministic perspective, naming is a form of dominance because it allows subjects to appropriate a process while expressing its significance. What I'm trying to stress is the importance of words and ways of naming. If these inhabitants thought that the houses were precarious or even more precarious than their houses in the slum, they would never move to the new neighborhood. So they exerted a collective resistance that allowed them to change the situation raised by the government officials. In an assembly, a neighbor said, "Those who resist like us will move to their definite houses." But verbalizing resistance is not equivalent to practicing it. As of September 2014, they exerted that collective resistance. In December 2015, they decided to move. It was their tactic to access to the definite houses, so they moved from fear to risk. Now, in our plan, let's turn to the conclusions. I would like to say that the relocation process fosters different modes of organization and participation, and that implies, on the one hand, different ways of inhabiting a territory, and on the other hand, different ways of demanding to the government and different opportunities to express their right to the city. Let me summarize briefly what I've just said. This table shows a comparison between the two groups. We can see that a hidden city was mainly composed by relatives who had a leader, who had participated previously in different organization activities, and who had dispute with those alien to the slum, specifically with social organization. So they didn't have any conflict with the government and decided to move to the temporary houses really quickly. While the inhabitants from 1st to 3rd Street were all neighbors, many of them were immigrants. They had no leader, so they appreciated the participation of social organizations. They did not participate in any collective experience, and they had bitter conflict with the government officials, so they moved over a year after the official decision. Something that I would like also to highlight is that while the inhabitants from Hidden City accessed to their definite houses in December 2015, the ones from Hidden City the ones from 1st to 3rd Street access to that houses last July. Another thing that I would like to underline is that once they move, assemblies cease. That is to say, I want to explain why the assemblies didn't succeed. First of all, because, as I already told you, there were uneven prior participation experiences. Second, because something that all the interviewees shared was the distrust toward politics and organization. When I asked them if they know any social organization, they said no and clarified that they didn't want to participate. In spite of this, the inhabitants from Hidden City could negotiate quickly with the government officials, and the ones from 1st to 3rd Street appreciated the participation of social organizations. Third, after participating for a while, awareness prevailed. Why? Well, first of all, because of the lack of information, and this is really important. The lack of response to all the letters sent, the changes that took place during the relocation process, and finally the disputes and prejudices among the inhabitants. But despite their inherent differences, both groups share the same conception of inhabiting a territory, because both groups claim respect for neighborhood layout. Living next to a neighbor, to a relative, to a friend, gave sense of security and protection in an unknown territory, in a deserted territory that had to be filled with meanings. So, how shall I continue after my stay here? Last July, as I've already told you, all the interviewees from 1st to 3rd Street moved to their definite houses after staying for almost 2 years in the temporary ones. So I would like to analyze that move and the ways of inhabiting those houses, and I'm addressing the question if that move grants right to the city. These pictures I took myself the day of the move. As you can see, the houses are really beautiful, but the neighbors are living in a neighborhood that hasn't been finished. As you can see, there is no asphalt, and this represents a really huge problem for the inhabitants. I think the significance of these happy faces is clear to all of us. What I'm trying to underline is how, despite all the drawbacks mentioned, a public policy can change the life of millions of people. And before finishing my presentation, let me quote former President Néstor Kirchner, who stated, "We should rise to the occasion, going from commitment to committed action." And that is exactly how I understand research. After having been at the new school for almost 2 weeks, I would like to thank for all the contributions that you have made to my research, which have raised new questions also to my new dissertation. And I think that in that sense, we are trying to use the language that tells the truth. I'm sorry, as Galeano pointed out. This stay here, this experience made me believe that for creative knowledge, we need not only a rigorous methodology and a rigorous theoretical framework, but also vivid imagination. We need more sensibility to the problems affecting daily life of millions of people. We need to listen to other perspectives and avoid accepting injustice. I cannot go on if I know that someone is suffering, that someone has his or her rights violated. And I really believe that it's precisely here at the university where we can foster knowledge that can change the life of millions of people, including ours. Not without them, but with them, not thinking that we have the knowledge, but sharing knowledge and experiences with others. So we are all part of an inclusive we. I think we have many responsibilities, but a just and fair world is possible. So let's go on building a senti pensante world, going from commitment to committed action. Thank you very much.
Paolo, want to come to the table as well? So thank you very much, Sophia. I just want to ask one question, and then I have 2 comments to have the two of you talk to each other. So my question is really related to your research method. And as an independent researcher working from the university, you have a lot of freedom to frame your questions and working with communities. So I wonder, how did you strategize about your engagement with the community? How did you gain the trust of the individuals with whom you spoke? And to what extent do you think that they were or weren't influenced by your intervention of doing the project?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that I'm a journalist, so I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an architect, but I'm interested in habitat. So that is a bit complicated. And the first time I visited the community was in 2009 as a volunteer of Techo. So when I started my research, I knew all these neighbors. And, sorry, I forgot the question.
So how did you gain the trust of the people you didn't
Well,
know? And did your actually doing the research project influence the outcomes?
Okay. Well, I think that a factor that is really important is time. As I met them since many years ago, and I participated in all the assemblies, I participated in all the meetings that they had with the different government officials, and I was thinking that if my dissertation started today, it would be really different from the one that I have written, because there is something that I know that now, and it's the importance of the process. No, I don't know if more, but it's so important, the process and the product. And in this case, what I would like to share is how these inhabitants suffer, the anguish that they felt during this process. And I think that it's a way of engagement, of trusting in the other. And I don't know if I answer your question in that sense.
Sure. No, that's fantastic. So let me just make one comment and observation, because I think what's interesting about these two papers juxtaposed against one another is it seems that each needs the information and the insight from the other perspective. So, we first heard from Paulo about naming the social actors in the My House, My Life context in Brazil, and the importance of understanding from the government's perspective the interest of the other groups. And you left us, Paulo, with a question that said, I don't know how to get the better community participation and how to work from that perspective. And then we heard from Sophia, who told us all about the community participation and how much the communities didn't appreciate or trust the government and did not want to participate. So This may seem a strange question, but I'll pose it anyway, which is, what advice would you give the other about how they thought about their research project and what they might not have missed or understood because they couldn't see it, you, Sophia, from the lens of the government, or you, Paulo, from the lens of the community?
Okay.
So what insights do you have for one another? And we'll start with Paulo, because I know he would like to begin, and appreciate the...
I can begin if you don't want.
Well, actually, I just would like to re-answer one of the questions that I didn't have the opportunity about the New York City that you told me. I think I was pretty negative with my answer, but actually, I know that here there's non-profit developers working, and that's an actor that we don't have in Brazil. We have cooperatives, but they are quite different, and I think that we could learn a lot because we could try to design policies to include this type of actor, and I think they have a commitment and maybe they have scale. That's also the complicated issue. Actually, my presentation was really focusing just one modality, and we do have one modality in the program that the problem is that doesn't have scale, and doesn't have scale not because the modality doesn't have scale, but we don't used to have it in the past. So it takes time to really to engage community and to produce. We are talking about an example about 500 houses. And I'm really not taking the merit of the process. I really understand the process, and we're producing now about 100,000 in a more cooperative way, where those beneficiaries participate since the selection of the site. And I really understand that's a possible way, but you need in the moment that scale is fundamental, the size of the problem is fundamental. Things need to go together. So that's the sense. That is really not a criticism about the process, but how do you maybe the challenge is how do I give scale to this process? And you told me, and I think that's important, that people are not so much engaged after they get houses, and this is what we see. So it's very difficult to create a program when you mobilize. So we have so much effort to mobilize these groups, and the groups actually as soon as they have reached the houses, they stopped acting as a group. So I think this is the quite of challenge that I would like to bring is how do I really transform that in a policy with a scale, that in a federal scale.
And any advice to Sophia about the government's perspective on her project?
Actually, I asked her to talk a little more about it. I would like to hear about because it seems that the government was not really participating articulately in the process, and I was quite surprised because in a way the result, maybe in a federal government perspective, but in my personal perspective as well, it was not so bad what we see in the relocate. We are not talking about relocation in this process, but we have a lot of relocation problems, for instance, with the Olympics Games. And that was the discussion that people should go there and they should participate in the process. Of the process that you told me that I don't know if the government is really supporting or how it's supporting, it's quite a very good example of the process. I understand the drama of the people, or I try to understand because it's very difficult to put in their position. But we see that they are translated not so far away from the area and that they are maybe still residents, but they will be inhabitants. We can see this in the future, and it's not what I see. So maybe the perspective of the government, it's really how can I get the scale and how they will really participate. And it's the government's important actor in this process, or it's not?
Yes, definitely.
So.
Well, Sophia, yes, advice for Paulo. Reaction.
Well, that's why I said that if I started my dissertation now, it will be completely different because the result is good. Now, most of the people are living in houses that they like, that are comfortable, and that are good houses for them. But if I have to think in some recommendations, I think I can't do any recommendation. But first of all, participation is really important, and not in a romantic way. I think a real participation is important because I have talked to him and he heard me saying this many times, but what I think we are discussing is the kind of society that we want to build. I really want a society who participates, who thinks that in a collective way can produce social transformations. And when I see that all these inhabitants don't want to participate anymore now that they have their houses, I'm seeing the consequences of neoliberalism in culture. I don't want to live in a individualistic, does it exist, society. I want to live in a society where solidarity is the most important word, and I think participation is a way of doing that. So my recommendations are two. First of all, yes, we need participation. The government participates in this process, obviously, but we need the participation of the inhabitants that are the protagonists of this process. And second, if you do a relocation, never move twice the inhabitants, from the slum to the new neighborhood, but not to the temporary houses, because that creates deep distress and anguish to the inhabitants.
That was very exciting for me to hear that, so I hope you enjoyed that. One more question, then we'll turn it to the audience. So my second question has to do with the role of power. You both mentioned power in the system, and I may be mischaracterizing, so you'll tell me if I got this wrong, but in Paolo's construction of power, there are a variety of stakeholders, and I think you implied that balancing the interest of the stakeholders was really the goal. So actually, more power leveling was your strategy. Whereas what I heard in your paper, Sophia, was that rather than using economic and financial and power balancing strategies, you were talking about meaning making and identity and purpose, and actually much more assertive uses of power to actually accomplish the desired goal. So I wonder how we can reconcile these two approaches and what the real power each of these groups has, and wonder why you, Sophia, chose something that was more based on informal power, whereas I heard you, Paolo, talking more about formal sources of power. So we'll go first with you, Sophia, about the power in your community.
Well, I like the idea of informal power, but I think there are power relationships in every place. As we are inhabiting different places, we are involved in power relationships all the time. I think the problem here is that the inhabitants don't have much power, or they can't take the same decisions as the government officials, and that's important. And I'm talking about participation. They could decide some things. For example, they decided where they were going to live. They decided where was going to be located the neighborhood, and I think that is a power position. But they couldn't decide, for example, in the design of the houses, they couldn't decide that to move to the definite houses instead of going first to the temporary houses and then to the definite ones, but at least they could resist. So I'm not saying that the state had all the power and the poor neighbors didn't have any power. They could negotiate, and well, Hidden City could negotiate and move quickly. So I think these are relationships and are changing all the time.
I really liked when you said that naming is a form of dominance. So I like that. That's my favorite piece of your paper. So Paolo, what about the power that was operating in your system?
Yes, maybe I cannot theorize so much about the question of the powers, because I'm really much more a pragmatic government perspective. But what I see and what I think maybe when I talked about myself, that's about power, is because when I was working in the private sector, and that's what I believe, is that we could do something better. That something better is possible. So most of the time when you're in the public sector, people believe that actually the government is powerless, everything is defined in the game, and everything will be bad in the future. So, or you literally need to change the system. The capitalism is the problem. Actually, that's not an option for me. I work for the government, and I need to be incremental in the way. And sometimes we go a step ahead and two back, and that's what I think. But what do I think, actually, as the federal government has much more power, and the bureaucratic body has much more power than it believes. And we just need to be more smart in the way we do. In the first research I did in my master, actually, I started saying something that there are developers and there are land markets in all the countries. and some of them, they are all getting very much profit. They are all very much profitable. But in some places, I don't know, the production is horrible, and some places is a little better. So there is a difference. So it's possible to have the profit and to produce a better city. I believe in that, or I need to believe in that. And I think it's all about power relationships and how you design. And I think in the federal government, you really have so much power to do that. I think that's one of the things that excites me a lot. It's really to try to address this problem in an effective way.
Well, it's really exciting to hear that each of you from your own position is really trying to leverage your own knowledge and influence to actually create a better set of outcomes. So that's a fantastic thing. That's a fantastic thing to see together, and very much a testament to the fellowship's purpose. So I'll turn the questions over to the audience to see if there are other specific questions about individual projects or more general questions, with a nod to the folks from Argentina who didn't get to comment on the source. If we have anybody who wants to ask about Sophia's project, and otherwise, to the back then.
Hi, Sophia. I was
Hi.
wondering, I heard you mention that you volunteered in this
Yes.
region, but was there any other thing that compelled you to do your the research or design
Okay, yes.
here?
Well, when I finished my career, before finishing my career, in fact, I applied for a fellowship, and I knew that I wanted to research in this slum. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I went to the psychologist, I talked to her, and then I decided that, yes, it's true, but it's true. And then I decided that I wanted to work there. And, well, the first day that my fellowship started, the floods occurred in La Plata. So the flood was really devastating for the community. And at the very beginning, I didn't realize that I had to research about that. But then I realized that, yes, that was the only thing that I had to do. At the very beginning, I wanted to research about the social actors that had participated in the slum from 1976 dictatorship and until now. And I did that, but I also, I must analyze this relocation process, because that was happening in the community, and the community was suffering that relocation process. So I decided to research that in that moment because of that.
I have a question. How's Brazil housing policies reflecting in climate change issue?
That's a very difficult question to answer, but yes, what I can say, actually, we now have a lot of cooperations with the German government and also with the Japanese government, and most out of this cooperation, they address the question of the sustainability and the environmental sustainability. Actually, we always try to bring the discussion, or to push the discussion to the social sustainability, because it's a main issue for us as well. But these discussions, for instance, we have used this social housing program at the federal level, and it's important to say that you have initiatives in the local level that doesn't depend of the federal level, so most of them I don't know, but in the federal level, so the use of solar heating systems, we are applying in all, it's compulsory in all the houses, and that created a market for this type of project. You also can say that some problems, but it's a good way as well to address. We are trying to promote the use, and then we pay a little more for the house if they are delivered with this, or produce the use of those electric solar systems as well. I don't know the translation, but also the panels, those panels. We are trying to promote that as well. And I think we have some initiatives about delivering the houses with LED lamps and things that are to provide like economy with the use of the land. But I don't think it goes much further than that, or what I know. I don't know much about new construction technologies, for instance. It's interesting to say just this topic. It's what I know, not about social housing program. But when you give the houses, actually the impact that you're going to have is much higher than they used to have, because they start to have access to a lot of infrastructure and, for instance, a lot of equipment and better refrigerator, TV, and a lot of other things that actually the consumption, when you make a social housing programs, actually the consumption of energy is going to grow a lot. So you need it's not always a very good way to address climate change. I think those actually countries that are really not contributing so much to climate change are those that have no development. So development usually comes with climate change problems. But sorry, I really don't know really much about this topic.
Hi. I wanted to ask Paolo. It reminded me a little bit of about the reflections regarding Chile's experience with housing, right? And the critiques that project, that political project had in terms of being market-oriented and the kinds of subjects also that it...
Chile.
Chile, yeah.
Okay.
And I wonder, and then I'm working in Venezuela also with a Great Housing Mission. Part of my project, doctoral project, is about that. And I see a lot of resemblances in terms of the sense of urgency, sacrificing quality over quantity. And so I wonder if there are spaces, maybe like transnational spaces, where public sector officials are discussing housing policies. If there's any sort of space where there's comparative analysis of these policies that have been going, it seems to be like there's models that are repeating and being copied out, but with very different outcomes in every different context. So I wonder about that, and I also wonder about the dialogue between the academic discussions and the discussion in the public sector, because there seems to be a very lively debate in anthropology and sociology and other disciplines about how infrastructure projects are never neutral, right? They're written with power, ideologies, etc. And so then, how do we dialogue at that level, I guess?
Yes, I think I think the sense of urgency, or the idea of fast land that I was discussing, and not so much the cheap land, it's an important concept. I don't think I did invent it, but I think it comes with my job. I would like to go further with this discussion, because it was the same thing even the city centers. The idea that the money needs to go fast, because actually you borrow the money and the money has a price, so you need to do fast. So everything in the city needs to be very much fast, and developing the periphery is very much fast. There's a strong argument in Latin America that's the need for housing. It's quite complicated to say, and I could say it, but I don't think that government could say, we are not going to produce 300,000 housing units this year. We are just going to build 10,000 housing units. We are going to see what's the result, and then we are going to evaluate, and the next we are going to do another 10,000 houses. That's the need for housing. It's a strong social argument, but it's also a strong capitalist argument. So it serves both of them, and that's, I think, the challenge, because they are both saying that we need to produce houses, one of them because they really need, and then with some of them because we need to be profitable, we need to have this market. I think this is quite similar in all the countries. About the results, I don't have this very much clear if we are producing the same thing. I have heard a lot about Mexico, and I think it's like the dolphin and the shark. They are very similar, but they are not the same. The results I would like to see, as we talked in the last time, we talked the discussion, the houses just delivered. I really think I'm talking about an exception in a way. It's an important exception. Okay, it's a huge problem. Maybe we're talking about 100,000 houses that are not very well located, but we are talking about a program that was 1.5 million, or modality that has 1.5 million. So most of the problems it's very difficult. Let me frame it another way. It's very difficult to really say what is happening in terms of quantity, because even urban insertion, and a lot of people were trying to do that in the academics, they could not define something that you really can map and say, okay, this is well located, this is bad located. It's quite difficult. It's not about just distance, and it's just not about our location. It's about the perceptions of those people that live there, if they have the opportunities, if they are distance of the opportunities. That's not a physical distance. So that's quite complicated. I don't know if I discuss it well. About the conversation between other countries, the problem is usually those that dialogue are not those that take decisions. And that's very complicated, because people that goes to those meetings, actually they are very much engaged on the topics. But then when you see those that are going to take the decisions, okay, we are going to listen to you, but they are not those that are going to define. So when you work in the federal government, you really have to very low expectations, but in the sense that any change that you do will have a huge result. I think that's the positive thing. So maybe you can move in the community, and we are really going to change. I build a school. I'm not going to build a school, but maybe my sidewalks, now it's 10 centimeters larger, and for me it's enough. In the federal government, it's much more like we do. And that's, I think, an important thing. Who discusses is not who takes the decisions. And the final is the academics. Actually, there's quite a gap between the academics and the practice in Brazil. I think that's something very good in the United States and also in Europe, because a lot of the governments go to the academics and try to make this. They bring the academics to the practice and the practice to the academics. And I don't think that we are doing this quite well. I think we could do it much better. I think it's much more a criticism. But for instance, those examples that I told you that that the federal government spent 1.5 million to support 30 studies, and 30 huge studies about it, they are very good in create awareness to really show the problem. It's the problem is there, but they are quite bad in show possible ways to solve and to accepting the challenge that was there. And the challenge was we need to make a lot of houses. We have a huge problem. How do we do? So I think they still need to dialogue better, so you can really find solutions together and not just create the awareness. I think that's also the commitment of the academy and depends of each one.
I think Mike had a question. You can mic up
Just a comment. We actually, in the observatory on Latin America, last year we produced a book comparing the experience of 6 Latin American countries exactly on that question. So if you want to talk about it, we can help you out.
Including Brazil.
Yes.
Did you have a question?
Well, first I'd like to congratulate you both, and I also would like to congratulate you for the question, because it was really a smart question. Paulo just went out, you just answered, you sort of gave an estimate of the numbers, but I'm sorry, I'm an economist. Do you have any idea of, the figures of this peripheralization concept? I know it's hard to define, you just mentioned this, but I don't know if you have worked somehow on this. Well, I have a special interest on this topic, so that's why I'm asking. And the other thing is, what is your take on on subsidies? Because you mentioned when you were asked about affordable housing here in New York, you sort of mentioned the use of subsidies, and we know, and you showed that. Actually, I had in mind that it was a little more than you mentioned. I used this 95% for the Tier 1 modality of houses, but maybe you probably have more accurate numbers than I. Anyway, $30 billion, right? That was the number that you showed, and we know that the Brazilian reality has changed a lot. So how do we keep up with this program in front of a different fiscal reality? And congratulations again.
How to continue is a very good question. We are trying to answer every day there, and it's a difficult question. Actually, we made a selection in this the beginning of this year. We started a totally new framework for the program. I didn't discuss it because it's quite new. So we create competitiveness between companies and put points for the urban insertion. So it was quite interesting. And I just realized that we got the results when I was here. So I didn't show because I also quite, maybe they are not going to use it. And the problem is that the changes of the money change a lot. We compete in the federal government for money from the health, for education, and it's quite complicated. And in this moment, we don't have money for much. And it's a very expensive program. So the tendency is actually we look for modalities or to think in a program that doesn't cost so much. So I think that was how do you think we continue. We can always reduce the goal, but the size of the problem doesn't resolve, so the doesn't reduce as well. So you need to think maybe we should, people in the beginning say we are giving houses for free, because if you consider the interest rate, they are almost for free. They are not charging for the price of the money as well. So people, what they pay, don't pay the price of the money that was invested. People deserved, but actually I cannot create a program that's going to give to everyone that deserves. So how do I do it? There are some of them and create priorities. You know that the beneficiaries, we have priorities, but we are not going to address everyone. So maybe we need to rethink the types of programs. So this modality, I think it's a complicated modality, continue in the way that it used to be, not in the money that we have now. About the size of the problem, it's a difficult thing because a lot of people are dedicating themselves to that. There's a very good book. One of those 30 researchers, actually, they collect and they wrote a book about it. So you can read, and they also don't have the data because you don't have the data. But the size of the problem is the political size and not the economical size. Doesn't matter how many developments you have in this situation. The fact that you have some of the developments in this situation, it's more than enough that you need to pay attention and address the problem, because it's a process that is happening, it's a phenomenon that is happening, and we need somehow to stop. So I really don't have the numbers, but I think we need to face it even if we don't know. About the numbers, it's not just about how to find these numbers, but to define. As I told you, it's quite difficult. Each one of us will define if you are how many people is exerting the right to the city in a proper way. It's impossible to find this number because each one of us will think that there's a limit there.
I think this is a contribution of the methodology of Marisa field, because, and that was exactly your question. I mean, this, you have to ask people many times. For example, many times
okay.
we imagine that people think one way or other.
But let's make it much more complicated. IPEA, the Institute of Economic and Applied Research in Brazil, they made evaluation of some housing programs. And they asked beneficiaries to see their perspective of that. And the perspective was super positive, actually, the results they have. You need to understand which question they made, what's the methodology, but it was very good, the perspective they have. And most of these people are very happy with the program. So we have a perspective, a urban perspective that it could be better, or maybe the question is not even if it could be better, as with the money that I'm investing, could I make something better? Because if I'm doing the periphery because I have no money and that was the best that I could do it, okay, I have a very good excuse. But if I could have done something better, and that's I think what I'm interested in, I think we could have done better maybe in some cases. And the subsidies, it was 95%. That's what really not clear because we changed it. Usually people used to pay just 5% of their income, and now we changed it from 10 to 15, increased the size. So maybe that's why do you think that the percentage of the subsidies changed?
I think we're out of time. Do we have time for one more question, or should we? Right here. Oh, there's two eager questions back here. All right, quickly, two eager questions. Here
I'd
and in the
like
back.
to make a question to Paulo. Actually, I would like to add a critic to the ones that you addressed. That is the public mass production center in the property. And I would like to ask you, why do you think the federal government incentivized home ownership instead of other kinds of properties? Especially thinking about this amount of subsidies that they have from our taxes.
Why? But let me see. first one's why home ownership?
Yeah, no, why federal government segregated home ownership
Yes.
instead of other kinds of properties?
Okay.
House.
And the other question?
No, that's the one question.
Oh, that's the one question. Why the federal government? First of all, there's a political reason as well. The dream of the own how do you say, the casa propia, to have your own home, it's something very strong in Brazil and have very strong appeal as well. The other thing that when you think about social housing or social rent, not that we don't have there, this model, it's a very complicated all in terms of governance to implement this type of structures. We don't have most of those actors. We should develop these actors, and I think that's the role of the federal government. Actually, I'm participating now in a group that is trying to discuss possibilities to create social housing. So one of the discussions, maybe I should not even say that, but one of the discussions, so are you still taping this? But one of the discussions that should I give to the beneficiaries the houses, or should I give to the municipality the houses so they can make use of these houses for longer? Because so we are still discussing this, but we know that for instance, examples of social rent managed by the public sector in Brazil, in São Paulo, they failure a lot. There's a lot of problems. In other terms, in economic terms, it's much cheaper to give a house that makes social rent, because social rent needs to come with social work as well for a long term. It's a different way of thinking. One is the house, one is inhabiting, and inhabiting is much more complicated. So then you have the problem that you're going to take these people out of the house. So it's a quite complicated discussion. Give the house, it's in the end a cheaper solution and much more easier to manage.
So I think we're going to have to defer the rest of the questions to one-on-one, and I want to stop here and thank both of you,
you so
for
much.
Fantastic presentations and congratulate you on great work, enthusiastically and purposefully presented. So as we say to all the Kirchner Fellows, you are the best and the ones we like the most that are here tonight. And when we see the next group in February, we may say that again, but we'll say it tonight.
Thank you
You
so
did
much.
a very nice job. Congratulations to both of you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.